From the beginning of Scripture, the story of redemption often unfolds like a love story, woven quietly into the lives of ordinary people. Sometimes that story appears openly, as in the royal language of Psalm 45. There a king stands in majesty, anointed with grace above his companions, and a bride is brought before him in garments of gold. Fragrance fills the palace. Music surrounds the celebration, and the queen stands at the right hand of the king in honor. It is a scene of royal union, a wedding that reveals both beauty and authority. Yet there are other places in Scripture where the same royal pattern appears in quieter form, almost hidden within the daily life of fields and families. The book of Ruth is one of those places. At first, the story seems simple. A famine drives a family from Bethlehem into a foreign land. Loss follows loss, until Naomi returns home with only one companion beside her, a young woman from the nations named Ruth. The journey back to Bethlehem looks like the return of two widows whose future has been emptied of hope. Yet beneath the surface of the story, another pattern begins to appear. The roles slowly become clear. The bride in the story is Ruth. The redeemer and groom is Boaz. Naomi stands between them as the wise guide of the household, the one who understands the order through which restoration must come. And surrounding the entire narrative is the quiet providence of God, guiding events that seem ordinary on the surface. When these elements come together, the structure begins to resemble the royal pattern described in Psalm 45. In the psalm, a king appears in majesty, and the bride is brought before him in honor. The union promises the continuation of a royal lineage that will endure in the land. In Ruth, the same movement unfolds, though in a more humble setting. The Redeemer does not appear in a palace, but in a field during the harvest. The bride is not led through a royal procession, but arrives as a gleaner, gathering the leftover grain behind the reapers. Yet the same covenant movement slowly begins to take shape. Ruth enters the field of Boaz. Boaz extends favor and protection over her. The path then moves toward the threshing floor, where the moment of covenant approaches. Finally, the redemption is confirmed at the city gate before the town elders. The geography of the story quietly traces a movement toward restoration. Bethlehem, the field, the threshing floor, the city gate. Step by step, the narrative moves toward the moment when the Redeemer restores what had been lost. Ancient readers noticed something even more fascinating about the field of Boaz. The imagery begins to resemble imagery from the Scriptures. A woman moves through a field under the protection of a generous lord, gathering the provisions of the land that has been prepared for her. The scene recalls the garden at the beginning of humanity's story. Yet the direction of the movement is reversed. In Genesis, humanity moved from the garden into exile. In Ruth, a woman from outside the covenant land moves toward restoration. Ruth begins at the edges of the field, gathering what remains behind the harvesters. She does not claim the field as her own. She walks in humility, receiving only what grace allows her to gather. Yet as the story unfolds, she is drawn closer to the center of the field until the moment arrives when she approaches the Redeemer himself. And here, another remarkable layer appears. Ruth is not an Israelite woman. She comes from Moab, a nation outside the covenant community. Yet when Naomi prepares to return to Bethlehem, Ruth speaks words that carry the weight of covenant commitment. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. These words are not merely a statement of loyalty to Naomi. They reveal a turning of the heart toward the God of Israel and the people who live under his covenant. Through this declaration, Ruth crosses a boundary. She moves from being an outsider to belonging among the covenant people. The story quietly reveals a prophetic movement. A woman from the nations enters the covenant and becomes part of the lineage through which the royal house of Israel will rise. As the narrative continues, Ruth's path draws her closer to Boaz through a series of steps that many readers overlook. She first enters his field during the harvest. She receives favor and protection among the workers. She is invited to eat at the Redeemer's table. Later, she approaches the threshing floor at night, where the story's most important moment unfolds. There she asks Boaz to spread his covering over her. Earlier, Boaz had blessed her, saying that she had come to take refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. Now, Ruth asks that this protection become a covenant covering through the Redeemer himself. The request is both humble and bold. She approaches the one who has the right to restore the inheritance of Naomi's household and asks him to act as Redeemer. The moment carries the quiet language of covenant union. From the threshing floor, the story moves to the final step, the city gate. There the elders gather, and the matter of redemption is settled openly before the people. The inheritance lost in exile is restored, and the Redeemer takes Ruth as his wife. What began with famine and loss now turns toward renewal. The union of Ruth and Boaz produces a child named Obed, Obed becomes the father of Jesse, and Jesse becomes the father of David. From the quiet fields of Bethlehem, the royal house begins to rise. The love story hidden within the scriptures continues to unfold. The bride is found, the Redeemer restores what was lost, and from their union the promise of the kingdom begins to grow again in the land. When the story reaches the threshing floor, the narrative's quiet movement reaches its most meaningful moment. The threshing floor was not simply a place where grain was processed after the harvest. In the life of Israel, it often became a place where decisions were made, where separation occurred between what was valuable and what was cast aside. Grain was gathered, the chaff was lifted by the wind, and what remained was the fruit of the harvest. Ruth arrives there with humility, following Naomi's guidance. The night is still, the work of the harvest has ended, and the Redeemer rests beside the grain that has been gathered. In this setting, Ruth approaches Boaz and asks him to spread his covering over her. The request carries the language of a covenant. The covering represents protection, belonging, and union. Earlier, Boaz had spoken of the wings of the God of Israel under which Ruth had come to take refuge. Now Ruth asks that this refuge become a living reality through the Redeemer himself. Boaz recognizes both the courage and the righteousness of her request. Yet there is still one matter that must be resolved. Another relative stands closer in the order of redemption. Before Boaz can fulfill the role of Redeemer, the matter must be settled publicly. So the story moves forward again. When morning comes, Boaz sends Ruth away with a gift of grain, 6 measures of barley placed into her cloak. The gesture is more than simple kindness. It is a sign that the process of redemption has begun but has not yet reached its completion. The work is moving toward fulfillment, yet one final step remains. The narrative then shifts from the quiet darkness of the threshing floor to the open space of the city gate. In the towns of ancient Israel, the gate was the place where matters of law and inheritance were settled. Elders gathered there to witness agreements, and decisions made at the gate carried the authority of the community. Boaz sits at the gate and waits for the nearer relative to pass by. When the man arrives, the matter of Naomi's land is placed before him. At first, the relative expresses interest in redeeming the property. But when he learns that the redemption also requires raising up the name of the deceased through marriage with Ruth, he withdraws. The responsibility passes to Boaz. Before the elders of Bethlehem, he declares that he will redeem the inheritance of Naomi's household and take Ruth as his wife. The elders bless the union and speak words that echo with ancient memory. They pray that the house of Boaz may become like the house of those through whom the people of Israel first multiplied in the land. In that moment, the restoration becomes complete. The inheritance that was nearly lost in exile is restored. The widow who entered the land as an outsider becomes the wife of the Redeemer. The household that believed its future had ended receives a new beginning. The story then moves quietly toward its final revelation. Ruth bears a son. The women of Bethlehem gather around Naomi and say that a child has been born to her. The one who once returned to Bethlehem in bitterness now holds a child in her arms. The emptiness that marked the beginning of the story has been replaced with renewal. The child is named Obed. And the genealogy that follows reveals the deeper purpose hidden within the narrative. Obed becomes the father of Jesse, and Jesse becomes the father of David. From the union of Ruth and Boaz, the royal house of Israel begins to rise. The story's movement becomes clear. A woman from the nations enters the covenant. A redeemer restores what was lost. A household that stood on the brink of disappearance regains its future. And from that future, the lineage of the king is born. What appeared at first as the quiet story of a family in Bethlehem becomes part of a much larger unfolding. The royal pattern described in Psalm 45, where the king and the bride stand together in honor, echoes again through the fields of Bethlehem. The Redeemer and the bride come together, and from their union the promise of the kingdom continues to grow in the land. There is another quiet pattern within the story that becomes visible when we look closely at the movement of Ruth toward the Redeemer. At the beginning of the narrative, Ruth appears at the edge of the field as a gleaner. She gathers the fragments left behind by the harvesters, receiving only what grace allows her to collect. She does not yet stand beside the Redeemer. She walks among the servants and gathers the remnants of the harvest. Yet, step by step, her position begins to change. Boaz notices her among the workers and speaks words of favor over her. He invites her to remain within his field and to stay close to the young women who serve there. Protection is extended over her, and she's allowed to gather freely among the sheaves. Later, the relationship deepens even further. Ruth is invited to eat at the table of the Redeemer. She sits among the workers and receives bread and grain from Boaz himself. What began as gleaning at the edges of the field becomes participation in the provision of the household. From that moment, the movement of the story begins to draw her closer to the center of redemption. Naomi later instructs Ruth to approach the threshing floor, where the Redeemer rests after the harvest. There, Ruth asks Boaz to spread his covering over her, acknowledging him as the one who has the right to restore the inheritance of the household. The final step takes place at the city gate, where the matter of redemption is settled before the elders of Bethlehem. When we trace these moments together, the story forms a quiet progression. Ruth begins at the edges of the field. She moves among the workers. She sits at the Redeemer's table. She approaches the threshing floor. The covenant covering is requested. The redemption is confirmed at the gate. Ancient readers sometimes noticed that this gradual movement resembles a bride's approach to the one who will receive her. What begins as distance slowly becomes closeness. What begins as the humility of a stranger becomes the honor of belonging within the household. By the end of the story, Ruth no longer stands at the edge of the field. She stands within the house of the Redeemer, and from that union a new lineage begins to rise in Bethlehem. The narrative quietly reveals the movement from outsider to bride, from gleaner to queen within the household of the Redeemer. And through that union, the promise of the kingdom continues to grow in the land. There is yet another detail in the story that often passes quietly before the reader's eyes, yet it carries remarkable depth when we pause to notice it. After the encounter at the threshing floor, when Ruth prepares to return to Naomi, Boaz places a gift of barley into her cloak. The text tells us that he measures out 6 portions of grain before sending her back to the house. At first, this seems like a simple gesture of kindness. Boaz does not want Ruth to return empty-handed, yet the number that appears here has drawn the attention of careful readers for generations. 6 measures are given. Throughout the Scriptures, the number 6 often represents work that has not yet been completed. It is the number that stands just before the 7th day, when the work of creation comes to rest and fullness is revealed. The gift of 6 measures of barley appears at a moment when the story itself is still unfinished. The Redeemer has acknowledged Ruth and promised to act on her behalf. But the legal matter of redemption has not yet been settled. Another relative still stands closer in the order of inheritance, and the question must be resolved at the city gate. So Ruth returns to Naomi carrying 6 measures of grain. It is as though the story itself is quietly saying that the work has begun, but the final step has not yet arrived. When Ruth comes into the house, Naomi immediately understands the meaning of what has happened. She tells Ruth to wait, for the Redeemer will not rest until the matter is settled that very day. And so the narrative moves toward its final act. Boaz goes to the city gate, where the elders of Bethlehem gather. There, the nearer relative is presented with the opportunity to redeem the inheritance. When he withdraws, Boaz publicly assumes the responsibility of redemption before the witnesses of the town. The 7th step arrives. The inheritance is restored. The bride is received. The household is renewed. What began with 6 measures of barley now moves into the completion of redemption. The symbolism quietly mirrors a larger pattern found throughout the Scriptures. Work unfolds through 6 movements, but the 7th reveals the fullness of restoration. The story that began with famine, loss, and exile reaches its fulfillment in the union of the bride and the Redeemer. From that union, a child is born, and the genealogy that follows reveals the deeper purpose hidden within the narrative. Obed becomes the father of Jesse. Jesse becomes the father of David. From the quiet fields of Bethlehem, the royal house begins to rise. The story of Ruth shows that redemption does not always appear with the sound of trumpets or the splendor of palaces. Sometimes it unfolds quietly through the kindness of a Redeemer, the faithfulness of a bride, and the patient unfolding of providence. Yet from that quiet beginning, the promise of the kingdom grows again in the land. Thank you, family, for being here. If this teaching helped you, please like, comment, and share. It truly helps this message reach those who are seeking. To our new subscribers, welcome. And if you'd like to go deeper, we invite you to join as a member. The link is in the description and on our homepage. We are praying for you and standing with you in the light of Messiah, he and Messiah, she. If you'd like to support the ministry, you can visit our store or bless our dear brother Michael via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below, which also includes a link to our second store with new designs. Thank you for your love and encouragement, and stay tuned for the next video. May the spirit of wisdom and peace rest upon you always.